You okay, Doc? He had been staring away to the west, along the coastline she had loved so much. It was a dull day, but the air was clear. You could see for miles, past the bulk of the Houndstown of Encombe, the dark shale of Smedmore's Kimmeridge, with its ledges pushing out to sea like black tentacles in the calm waters, even as far away as the pallid, jagged teeth of Gad Cliff at Tyneham on the Army Ranges beyond. To the south, a solitary sailing yacht wallowed in the race off the headland, its mainsail flapping as it motor-sailed through the unusually tranquil seas. There was not a breath of wind. He looked at Adrian with the detachment of somebody miles away, barely noting his air of concern. He looked down at the small urn in his hands and removed the lid. Her ashes looked gritty. Out over the seaward edge of the headland to the west, she'd requested. A large stone had been carved to make a memorial seat for someone else close to the point he chose. He stepped out to the edge. The cliff cascaded away below him in a series of huge vertical slabs of Purbeck stone before levelling out at its foot, becoming a gentler slope covered in vast boulders where it met the sea. He carefully poured the contents of the urn into space, and they drifted down the cliff face in a dusty stream and disappeared. How simple it would be to just let go and follow them. He had been holding his breath, but now great sobs burst from him, and he started to shake uncontrollably, like somebody with a rigor. He felt Adrian's arm around his shoulders as he pulled him gently back from the edge. "There we are. Job done. Do you want to go into the chapel?" It was comforting in the tiny ancient building on the headland. Cold, dark stone, and empty, but comforting somehow. He didn't pray. There wasn't a God to pray to as far as he was concerned, not after what had happened to Rosie. So he said a few words to her instead. He hadn't stopped speaking to her since she had died anyway, and he felt a sense of peace afterwards. After a short while, Adrian led him out. They left Rosie where they'd scattered her, down the cliff face among the rocks and the thrift and the sea kale, with the fulmars circling silently above her, effortlessly stiff-winged. Not being awake when she went had been the hardest part. She had died in his arms, for sure, but he had woken to her stiffening, cold, blue-white body, not the soft, warm one he had cradled while she went to sleep. Simon didn't know what he had expected. He felt guilty that he hadn't instinctively woken when she died, as if the moment should have had enough energy to stir him. He felt, ridiculously, cheated by the lack of a final goodbye. That was unfair of him, because although she slid in and out of consciousness without saying much during the last 2 days of her life, she had stirred, opened her eyes and looked straight at him and said, "I love you," just before she went to sleep for the last time. How much better than that does it get? Well, it gets better than that when the person who says it has more living to do. He didn't know how he got through the funeral service or the even more grueling ceremony at the crematorium. His recollection was that of someone in a trance, staring blankly and dry-eyed straight ahead, even as the preposterous little curtains jiggled across to hide the coffin from view before it slid towards the furnace. Without Adrian's support it would have been impossible. He, his friends, and his work colleagues were all he had to lean on. Simon had been orphaned at the age of 12, courtesy of a car crash, when his parents were returning from a party, probably with far too many gins on board, in those naive times of one for the road. Nobody else had been involved at any rate, just an ill-placed tree and the gregarious couple who had been mum and dad to their only child. That's when his Yeoman's Row auntie had stepped in. She had been his foster mum, his source of love and succour, his shelter, anchor and comforter, until cancer had taken her away too, 6 years ago. Rose's parents refused to attend their daughter's funeral. They had always been distant, physically and emotionally, towards him. They had sought in vain the qualities in him their daughter had found so seductive, and found him wanting. He had thwarted their ambitions to marry Rosie off to the son of a local Texan family with enormously deep, oil-fed pockets, but now they blamed him for the death of their daughter. Her father accused Simon of colluding with his colleagues to hasten Rosie's death by not attempting to treat her disease. They were convinced that active intervention, however misguided or however late, might have resulted in some miraculous cure, notwithstanding how mutilating or disabling the intervention might have been. It was a typically American viewpoint. Their medicine employed it too, and it was a viewpoint Simon could sympathize with and found difficult to refute. In the aftermath and in the depths of his grief, he, too, doubted their course of inaction, even though he knew professionally that any action would only have caused Rosie extra suffering. In any case, he certainly couldn't talk to her father about the quality of life Rosie had crammed into her last few months. He couldn't, for example, discuss the afternoon at the Hotel La Fenice in Venice, when, drowsy amongst rumpled sheets, listening to the sound of operatic arias being rehearsed across the narrow street, through their open bedroom window, after an amazing lunch, and even more amazing lovemaking, Rosie, damp with exertion, she had insisted he did not treat her like porcelain, and still naked, snuggled up against him and whispered, chuckling, "Thank God they left me both tits." No, he couldn't have discussed Rosie's last few weeks, but they were grieving the loss of their darling daughter too. He was surprised by the support he received from everybody. Even Prosser suspended hostilities and offered sympathetic condolences. In fact, he so surprised Simon by doing so that he was one of the very few who witnessed him cracking. Simon broke down in front of him, and he was horrified. Simon found his sympathy even more unsettling than his habitual hostility. Otherwise, he existed behind a brittle facade of numb automatic behavior. Adrian was his savior. He understood instinctively when to give him space and when he needed a crutch. He was alert enough to spot the danger signs. To Simon, it was the most straightforward and logical decision in the world. Rosie had gone. He wanted to go too. The question was, how? Adrian went straight to Prof, he learnt later. Never deferential, and with his typical forthright manner, he apparently asked Prof a couple of rhetorical questions. It went something like this. "Prof, you'll never guess what Simon has bought himself." "Enlighten me," said Prof. "Only a motorbike. Not any old motorbike, mind you. This is the Nat's Nuts of motorbikes, the fastest road-going bike BMW make. And you know what he's going to do with it, don't you?" It was during his short incarceration as an inpatient of Prof's at the Priory, Roehampton, that the numbness broke like a breached dam and he was able to grieve properly. He felt his grief tearing him to pieces. It was like being hurled into a bottomless dark pit by a hurricane of sorrow, and his downward journey seemed to last forever. It ceased eventually, but he thought it had probably scarred him permanently. But he was still here, and he was able to function normally now, just about. And for the former, he was indebted to Adrian. He hadn't thought so for a while, but he was grateful for the fact that he was still here now. Really, he was. He went through to the kitchen at the back of the house and made himself eat the meal his cleaning lady had prepared for him. He had just about got used to eating on his own. He still found preparing solitary meals for himself too difficult. He'd start enthusiastically enough, following a recipe from Elizabeth David, but despite his love of French, and particularly Italian cooking, he would lose not only interest but also appetite. Of the many mundane tasks of living, he thought cooking a solitary meal for yourself was one of the more poignant reminders of just how alone you were. He admired an old friend of his aunt, a jolly, overweight widower, who made himself into a chef after his wife died. He cooked succulent and exotic meals for half a dozen friends on a regular basis, many of which, courtesy of Aunt May, Simon attended. He remembered asking him why he went to such trouble and effort. "I'm no good at my own company," was the reply. Simon now knew how he felt. However, Simon was no chef. The desultory refueling completed, he took another glass of red with him to his desk and started on the manuscripts. Heeding Alice's warning, he began with the most recent accounts. On the top of the pile, and the catalyst for his involvement, was the guide's written account of the incident in the gallery, which ended with the American's death. Not much to go on, just a sudden inexplicable collapse of two people at the same time. The widow thought she heard a strange rustling noise and felt a blast of very cold air, but nobody else felt, heard, or saw anything unusual apart from the two people collapsing. Poor Wilbur Cross had obviously been but a whisper away from death anyway. The post-mortem had shown a cardiovascular system riddled with advanced arteriosclerosis in an obese septuagenarian. The cause of death was given as myocardial infarction upon complete occlusion of the anterior coronary artery, in other words, a heart attack. The pathologist had remarked that the other coronary arteries were in similarly poor shape. He was more interested in the young woman, though. She had come round talking gibberish, which the guide thought might have been archaic English. Where was this young woman now? He looked through the notes beyond, and found that she had also been taken to Kingston casualty by ambulance, but after and more sedately than Wilbur Cross. She too had been assessed by the duty medical registrar and discharged home to her flat in central London that same day without a diagnosis. The registrar had recommended that her GP arrange a psychiatric assessment as an outpatient because, although he had discerned no medical disability, he had found her demeanour strange. Disappointingly, he had not qualified the nature of her strangeness in more detail. The notes revealed nothing more. Some of the earlier accounts of hauntings were intriguing. Hampton Court Palace was the most haunted site in Britain. 30 spectral sightings at least. Most evident was the frequency with which the ghost of a young woman was seen and heard, running down the gallery in her nightgown, and the consistency of the descriptions of her. But there were descriptions, too, of figures in other rooms. A woman's figure, dark and indistinct, had been seen in the kitchens. A troop of yeoman guards had been seen running up the main stairway to the great hall. A bulky male figure in Tudor clothes stood in the great watching chamber, and disappeared like smoke dispersed by a gust of wind. A disembodied hand, carefully described, rapped at the door to the king's pew back in the Queen's gallery. The hand was described as wearing a fine and pretty ring. Two things struck him about the accounts. The first was the frequency of the sightings of the young woman in the gallery. She had been seen on so many occasions throughout the centuries, but, and this was the second thing, only since the execution of Queen Catherine Howard on Monday the 13th of February in the year 1542. The earliest account he could find of her was in 1543. So was this a true haunting, or the expression of guilty consciences in those who had engineered her demise? Like Macbeth, you might see people who weren't there if you felt guilty about having made sure they couldn't possibly be. You might even see the murdered person. Of course, that wouldn't explain the sightings continuing down the centuries ever since, but the similarity of accounts from then on could be explained by the transmission of the legend by word of mouth. Not just suggestibility, but people seeing something they have already had described to them, in the room where they have been told it has appeared. But in some of the more recent sightings, not only had the people who witnessed something no knowledge of the hauntings, but scant knowledge of the history of the palace. In fact, in the way of the modern world, they had scant knowledge of any history at all. He took himself to bed, thinking of the school days doggerel about the 6 wives of King Henry VIII. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. Did the ghost of Catherine Howard really haunt that gallery, and what of Anne Boleyn, the other executed queen? Did her ghost also haunt the palace? Another tableau of reflected guilt? On such musings he fell into an uneasy sleep, though his last conscious thought was a pleasing one, about large, smoky, green eyes under a heavy fringe, and a dazzling smile. A loud scream shattered the silence in the dark corridor. In the flickering light from the wall sconces, a female figure in a white nightgown could be seen running as fast as she could into the gallery from the ornate Tudor entrance. She screamed again as her bare feet slipped in the rushes strewn on the bare oak floorboards, nearly tumbling her to the floor. She clutched at the hem of the nightgown which was impeding her running, and hitched it up above her hip. She was careless of her modesty in her haste. Her bare legs flashed as she ran on. The nightgown gapes open at the front, revealing full youthful breasts. Her dark blonde hair streamed out behind her, and her eyes were wide and staring, her pupils dilated with terror. She reached a dark oak door and wrenched at it. It was locked. She started hammering at the door with frustrated blows and shrieked with fear, but the sound was masked by a louder noise from the other end of the corridor, of many heavily shod feet. Yeoman guards dressed in uniform, carrying halberds, came round the corner. A hand reached for the abundant cascade of hair which fell almost to the girl's waist, and yanked on it viciously. The strange echoing shrieks were brutally cut off. He awoke with a start and sat upright in bed in a muck sweat. It was 3:30 in the morning. He went downstairs feeling jittery and made himself a cup of tea. He dreamed occasionally, though never like that. He wasn't prone to nightmares, and was that a nightmare? While drinking, he leafed casually through the early vellum sheets again. On the back of one was a sketch he hadn't noticed the first time through. It was a detailed sketch of a ring. The pretty ring, perhaps? He made a note to ask Alice about it. When he felt calm enough, he went back to bed, hoping for sleep, only to dream once more. At least he presumed it was a dream. Rosie came into the bedroom, because there she was, standing beside him, dressed in one of her favourite nighties, just as if she had risen and come round to his side of the bed, as she had so often. The trouble was, she'd walked straight through the outside wall into the first-floor bedroom. It was the first time he dreamt about Rosie for a long time. He called out her name. She didn't reply, but she did smile at him. It wasn't a beaming smile. It was almost a worried one, perhaps one of acquiescence. Then she faded away. He shouted out for her to stay. She still went. He woke at his usual time. Strangely enough, he felt rested and refreshed, nourished. As he crossed Westminster Bridge, he ticked off a mental list of equipment Adrian and he could cobble together quickly enough. He wondered how far Adrian had got with the infrared monitor. Adrian wasn't just his saviour. He was Simon's whiz-kid technician, his right arm and partner in their research program, as well as his best friend. Without him, nothing in Simon's research would have been possible. He'd known him since his student days, when he'd been a gauche kid with an unkempt appearance and an unbelievable ability to invent, mend and maintain all things electronic. Simon had first come across him when Adrian was in charge of gas chromatography units, seen him through electrocardiography and electroencephalography monitors and computerized tomography imaging, CT scanners. Adrian was the only person who understood the machinery when EMI first introduced the CT scanner, so he'd been put in charge of it. "Hello, Doc," he'd said when Simon put his head round the door, curious to see this latest technology. "Do you want to see what the Beatles have done for us?" "What do you mean, what the Beatles have done for us?" "They've made EMI so much dosh they've been able to afford to complete all the research on this bit of kit. I tell you what, Doc, this is going to be right up your street. Takes all-round images of your bonds by imaging endlessly in tiny slices at a time, puts them all through a computer, which puts all the slices back together, and voila, a three-dimensional picture of the inside of your head. Sort of ideal, really, for your speciality, innit? You can go, 'Nah, Mr. Joe Public, you ain't got nuts. You've got a brain tumour there, see?' Very useful, I agree. Now all we've got to do is come up with a cure for brain tumours." "Yeah, well," he'd given Simon a funny look. "Some can be cured, though, can't they? Brain tumours, I mean." "Yes, some." "Can it take pictures of the whole body?" "Nah, way to go yet. Your bonds, limbs, things like that. Mind you, I don't think this is the way forward. I hear someone in the States has got some magnetic field thing going. Makes nuclei, protons, electrons and stuff resonate and align themselves. They stop farting about, and you can make images of them. Brilliant." "Why would that be better than taking CT scans?" "Irradiation, Doc. CT scans irradiate you with X-rays, lots of them. Can't go belting the body with too much of that. Imagine a expecting mum. Obstetrician goes, 'We want to do a CT scan of your belly.' Hopefully, expert goes, 'No way. Wouldn't work, see? You'd have little tiddlywink going arse over tit inside like a soldier doing the Spandau Ballet. Poor little sod would be buggered. Don't have that problem with ultrasound or this magnetic stuff. Safe as houses." "I'll take your word for it." Simon was grinning openly at the recollection as he strode across the bridge. Adrian had been right, of course. It had proved to be a very useful investigative tool for their department. They scanned lots of brains, so they saw more of each other, much more. They shared beers in the student bar. Adrian was present at the party to celebrate Simon's appointment as a consultant. He was at Simon and Rose's wedding too, where, in a tipsy moment towards the end of the celebrating, after Simon had pulled him off Rose's matron of honour, a married cousin who had been in danger of losing the right to the honour title as a result of his persuasive advances. He asked if he could help with the research project. How he'd learned of it, Simon didn't know, because he'd told nobody about it at the time. Having him look after the technical side of the investigations would be invaluable. Simon hadn't hesitated. He hadn't regretted it either. Casualty was the usual bedlam this Saturday morning, full of people who should have been attending their general practitioners' surgeries, if the bloody places had been open and their practitioners practicing. Some of the cheeky bastards even had notices on their locked surgery doors telling their patients to go to the nearest hospital casualty department. St Thomas's Hospital's catchment area encompassed the boroughs of Lambeth, Lewisham and Southwark. Picture the scene for yourself. Once through that mayhem, though, and into the large corridor which ran along the ground floor of the East Wing, due west towards the river, the hospital was eerily quiet. Simon turned the corner into the massive Victorian corridor which ran parallel to the river, stretching almost the entire distance between Westminster and Lambeth bridges. Glancing fondly at the marble figure of a young but already matronly Queen Victoria, staring down at him with imperious disdain from her marble throne on its marble plinth. Her plinth was situated at the junction of the two corridors. At her very feet he had experienced a ghostly encounter many years before. He had been returning wearily from the Mary wards. The obstetric unit and gynecology wards in those days were situated in the most southerly block, to his room in the East Wing in the early hours of the morning, after conducting a difficult forceps delivery. He was a senior house officer in obstetrics and gynecology at that time, and, tired though he was, he had hurried down the corridor, not just to get back to bed as soon as possible, to resume his interrupted sleep, but also because that empty corridor is a disquieting place at 3 a.m, especially when you are recalling the ghostly tales heard as a student of encounters with strange figures. The Grey Lady, or most famously the Lady with the Lamp, Florence Nightingale herself, her spectral figure performing yet another round of the hospital. He had been 100 feet or so from the marble effigy of Her Imperial Majesty, when a tall patrician figure glided into the corridor from the staircase leading to George Ward on his right. The figure had appeared to move with no sound, bedroom slippers, and no obvious ambulation, full-length dressing gown to the floor, had a sun-bronzed, battered face and head of untamable curly silver hair, jeans. He had looked like an ancient, like a Greek god, and Simon had been terrified that he was truly experiencing a ghost, until the ghost had addressed him in cultured English. He had bidden Simon to sit with him for a moment at the feet of Victoria. They squatted on the plinth. He had been solicitous about Simon's state of health. He said he looked exhausted. Simon was. He had asked if Simon had a cigarette. He had. Most of them did then. Not such a heinous crime in those days, but certainly one that Sister George had forbidden my apparition to indulge, apparently. Simon had been too tired to make much conversation, but smoking a cigarette after the exhausting birthing the mother and he'd both just been through felt like a grand idea. So they had seated themselves and smoked at Queen Victoria's feet in rebellious camaraderie. Apart from learning that he was an inpatient on George Ward and an insomniac with a special dispensation to walk the corridors at night, Simon had learned little else, not even his name, being too tired to ask. But having completed their companionable smoke, they had parted company with an invitation from the ghost to visit him the next day on the ward. At an appropriately quiet time in the daily routine of a general medical ward, the following day Simon had duly presented himself in a half-decent state, given his lack of sleep, at the entrance to George Ward. The status of sisters of wards and departments had a peak just below that of matrons, and it resided on George Ward. George Ward was a very important ward. Sister George was a very important sister. Sister George was terrifying. Sister George was quite inexplicably behaving completely out of character that morning. She was flapping, almost clucking, like a broody hen. This iceberg of a woman, capable of freezing a consultant physician's balls with a single glance, was behaving like a novice. "Where have you been? He's been asking for you all morning," she had said to Simon as he entered. He had no idea Sister George even knew who he was. He had rather hoped she didn't. A young nurse he did know had grabbed him by the hand and pulled him back to the entrance. "What's going on, Simon? How does himself know you?" "Himself? Who's himself?" She had given him an old-fashioned look. "He's in the first bed on the left inside the door. Insists on that. Can't be anywhere near the back because of his Great War experiences. Left for dead at the back of a first aid station field tent, apparently." She saw his bewildered expression. "Simon, you do know who you are about to see, don't you?" "No, not really." He had paused, grinning foolishly. "Just some chap I met in the corridor at 3 o'clock this morning." "You think Sister George allows just anybody to wander about the hospital at night?" "Well, I was too tired to think about that." Something had begun to dawn on him. Come to think of it, he did look sort of familiar. He thought about Sister George's extraordinary behaviour. You mean he's somebody famous? Yes, she had hissed in his ear, you numbskull. Well, he is if you're half literate. The sort of familiar person you met this morning is the poet, Robert Graves. Simon remembered his discomfort and discomposure as he went to the foot of the great man's bed. Graves had been charming, though, thanking him in a conspiratorial fashion for the solicited cigarette and for his company. And he had been genuinely interested in Simon, it appeared, and they spent quite a time chatting, which had earned him hostile, jealous glances from Sister George. He remembered with sadness that Graves had expressed concern then about his memory and recall. It clearly concerned him more than whatever ailment had brought him to hospital. Given his intellect, hardly surprising. And, of course, Simon remembered, his wife Beryl had sheltered him from the public for years afterwards, as he slid into dementia. They parted firm friends when he left his bedside. His most poignant memory was that Graves had chuckled when Simon admitted that he had thought he was seeing a ghost when they met in the corridor. A ghost, he had said. I've had to live with ghosts all my life. How had he described himself to Simon? Incongruously, as a farmer poet from Mallorca. Simon turned the corner into the George Block stairway, through the same entrance from which his ghost had appeared, but went downstairs to the basement rather than up to George Ward, down to Adrian's domain underground, to the service tunnel, which mirrored the route of the impressive corridor above. It lacked the alabaster busts of long-dead luminaries of his calling and nursing, or the marble floors, but instead the walls were stolid, painted London brick, clicking, gurgling, steaming conduits of thousands of yards of electric cabling, water pipes, and no doubt, somewhere, drains. Down here were the morgue and the X-ray department, hence Adrian, as if the governors had deemed it prudent to house this newfangled X-ray stuff where any damage it might do could be contained out of sight, along with the incriminating evidence of obvious medical and surgical failures trafficking to the morgue. Simon found Adrian in his lab, close to the X-ray department. He had the back of something that looked not unlike a television. From it sprang hundreds of wires. What's that? Adrian looked up, removing a screwdriver from between his teeth. His thin face carried its characteristic quirky grin, his grey eyes their characteristic sardonic expression. He always looked as if he was finding life a huge joke. Maybe it was Simon he constantly found so amusing. This, he said, is the dog's bollocks, the latest generation of Adrian's patented ghost-busting technology. This will pick up infrared and electromagnetic field changes, both. This will give us reproducible images of ghosts. Good, Simon said. Get the back on it and come with me. Oh yes, Jesus. Certainly, Jesus. Bugger the fishing. I'll just drop everything and follow you, now. Yes, you will. And remind me to check you out properly for Tourette's syndrome. By the way, now means Monday afternoon, as soon as I've tidied up things in the department. You make sure that the machine's ready. We're off ghost hunting. His eyes glittered. You mean after you've given Caliban the glad tidings that he's got to get off his arse? Caliban was Adrian's name for Prosser. Simon didn't know why. Savage and deformed was about right for Prosser, though. Slave, the bastard definitely wasn't. Simon grinned at him. Yeah, we've got a big assignment here, Pilgrim, and clearance from God. So you just pack your saddlebags and we hit the trail. What? Just quoting John Wayne from the film The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Oh, what do I know? I'm just a model. Eh? Nothing, just a catchphrase from a naughty film called Confessions of a Soho Girl. You shouldn't watch stuff like that. You'll go blind. St. Thomas's had a different atmosphere on Monday morning. Casualty was much calmer, passing through it much easier. The rest of the hospital was now humming with activity, the corridor a throng of bustling, scurrying, uniformed staff. Physiotherapists in short tunics and tight trousers vied with nurses in striped dresses with starched aprons, and medical staff in long white flapping coats, to see who could trample more bewildered and often maimed patients and visitors underfoot with their manic urgency. But to Simon's eyes, everything this morning was tinted with the rosy glow of someone who is about to go on sabbatical. He went up to Scutari to find Mandy. He wanted to check how much cover had been provided for his NHS commitments. It was all very well for the Controller General of Her Majesty's Royal Palaces to say it would have been dealt with. He didn't know the NHS, and he didn't know Prosser. Simon also wanted to find out about the girl who'd been seen in Kingston Casualty, then discharged. Where was Heather Pilkington now? And was she ill, or had she recovered? He asked one of the department's secretaries to find out. He was about to knock on Mandy's office door when, through it, he heard the less than dulcet tones of the man himself. Prosser was shouting as usual, but even so, Simon couldn't catch everything he said. "I'm not doing... bloody ghosts... load of bollocks... my work just as important..." Those words, more than enough to give Simon the gist, he heard. Mandy's reply he couldn't hear at all. "Bet he's still ill. Bend, trolley, about time someone tells him to do some ordinary work." These last words were yelled from what sounded to be just the other side of the door. It was wrenched open, and Simon was suddenly face to face with his cooperative colleague. Prosser's bulky body filled the doorframe. His fiercely controlled, crinkly blonde hair was the only tame part of him. Simon had hoped to introduce him to the enforced sabbatical gently, in a quiet corner somewhere, hoping through coercion to make him accept it, at least for a short time. No such luck. "Ah, the about-to-be-absent maestro himself. Off on another wild-goose chase, or should I say ghost chase, again, are we? Leaving us poor mortals behind to do your NHS grind, while you swan around doing something completely bloody useless." He pulsated with animosity and jealousy. The nostrils of his large nose were flared like a horse's. Spittle flew from protruding teeth. "Sounds more like sheltered occupation to me. Are you bloody well still ill?" This was a rhetorical question as far as Prosser was concerned. He was convinced, Simon was. He had tried to engineer Simon's permanent dismissal from the department on the grounds of ill health, so that a permanent replacement could be found. What he really wanted was a new consultant with no research brief who would be junior to him. Simon wasn't. Whom he could bully into doing an unfair share of the NHS grind. The motive lay in his idle nature. They all coped with extra work when research beckoned one of them away, but not all research was granted equal status by the hospital. Prosser's had a lower priority than Simon's at the moment. Just how much lower, you have no idea, thought Simon to himself with a glow of satisfaction. That meant Prosser did more covering of the grind than Simon at the moment. He resented it. "Yup, sorry about it, but I have been summoned to do the investigation as a high priority." Simon was trembling with suppressed laughter at Prosser's ridiculous overreaction, but spoke with deliberate calm because he knew it would wind the fool up even more. Priority was a bad word to use with Prosser, but Simon saw no virtue in pussyfooting around. Simon was the enemy already. Things could hardly get worse. "How can your nonsense be given high priority?" He was beside himself. Simon couldn't answer that without involving royalty. I can't answer that without involving royalty, he said. Look, why don't you go and air your grievance with Prof? And smiled at him beatifically. Cowardly, perhaps. Naughty, definitely. He shouldn't wind him up, but it was difficult not to. The man was such an arsehole. Anyway, Prof was well able to deal with Prosser, and Prosser wouldn't listen to anyone else. Royalty my arse, he muttered through gritted teeth. There was something Simon was going to have out with him, though, whatever the consequences. By the way, the next time you decide you have too much work because of some esoteric appointment at the Maudsley, don't just dump the problem with the nurse in charge like the bloody backslider you are. Ask a colleague to help out. Nicely. The request should come from you. It's called manners. For one farcical second, Simon thought Prosser was going to hit him, but he just stood there quivering with anger. Simon had rendered him speechless, apparently. He licked his lips, gave Simon a nasty sneer, turned abruptly on his heel, and stormed off down the corridor, all venom and flapping long white coat-tails. Mandy spoke to Simon through the now empty doorway. Don't you think my job is difficult enough as it is? When are you two going to stop all this nonsense? When Prosser stops resenting me, I suppose. Well, we're in for one hell of a long wait then, aren't we? But you could at least stop winding him up. I'm sorry, he said. Apologies generally, it would appear, this morning. Yes, well, Gerald Prosser is hardly going to get a sympathetic hearing from the boss, is he? So we can expect tempers to fray more. Nevertheless, with however much ill grace, all is in hand to cover your work. Prosser can do nothing about it. He cannot defy Prof. My advice to you is to grab your partner in crime and make yourself scarce. She shook her head, making the lace on her cap bounce. A mother figure in lace and polka dots, a tall, dark-haired, dark-eyed, attractive woman, with an intimidatingly statuesque figure, which would have made her a beauty in another age. The trouble is, you look like the cat that got the cream. Have you been wearing that expression since Friday morning? I don't know. Probably. Will you keep a special eye on the young lass with the puerperal psychosis for me, please? Yes, of course I will. Now go on, beat it. Just going. By the way, how was your father? Oh, not too bad. He's a bit of a creaking gait these days, I'm afraid. Her eyes glistened. He lunged forward and kissed her on the cheek, just in front of the glossy curls escaping from her cap. He didn't know what made him do it. A sudden impulse. It was a risky thing to do, so he left, fast, before there were consequences. And, suddenly embarrassed, he looked back over his shoulder. Beneath the lace cap he didn't see the expected face of Thunder, but one with a slight smile, and despite her olive complexion, the faintest of blushes. The secretary pushed a slip of paper into Simon's hand as he left the department. Heather Pilkington was worse than ill. She had been admitted to the Maudsley 2 days after being discharged from Kingston, but not sectioned. She had discharged herself 48 hours later, and half an hour after that, according to witnesses, had calmly thrown herself from London Bridge. Her body had been recovered downstream somewhere in the lower pool of the London docks. So Heather Pilkington was not going to be telling anyone what had happened in the gallery unless she had already told them at the Maudsley. But what the hell had driven a healthy young woman so precipitately to suicide? Something in that gallery now had 2 deaths on its hands. He tied up all the other loose ends he could. He undertook a final ward round of his inpatients and was gratified to see that the young woman with the puerperal psychosis was responding. He grabbed some reading material and notes from his earlier research on hauntings, took a last look around for anything he might need, glanced through the window one more time at the view of the Houses of Parliament opposite, and went to find Adrian. Adrian drove them both to Hampton Court in his clapped-out Volkswagen camper van. Simon's car wouldn't take all the kit. Thank God it wasn't painted in psychedelic graffiti or spray-on suede. They were still subjected to old-fashioned looks when they arrived at the vehicle barrier, though, and were only grudgingly allowed through after their identities had been ponderously studied and right to be there checked by telephone. "Pigs," said Adrian, as the barrier was eventually raised. "Language," Simon warned. "Okay, fuck." Simon got a hand over his mouth just in time. The security guard didn't look like the sort of person who would tolerate being verbally abused. They lugged the monitors, microphones, recorders, and wiring through the kitchens, up the service stairs, which would now be linked forever in Simon's mind with a certain erotic moment, through the horn room, great watching chamber, and into the haunted gallery. "Don't like the feel of this place already." Likewise. "Where are we going to put the stuff?" "What about the corner so we can see down both limbs of the gallery?" "Yeah, looks okay. Where are the PowerPoints?" They discovered them under metal flaps in the floor. Adrian unfolded a large trestle table and looked around. "Bit gloomy, innit?" he said. "Would be better if they didn't have all these dark tapestries everywhere. What's wrong with the woman in this one? Is she dying?" "No, they're based on the Greek myths, apparently. That's Dido fainting into her attendant's arms. Her lover, Aeneas, was departing Carthage. Summoned by the god Mercury, Simon was quoting Alice. Thinking of Alice started the excited teenager thing again." Adrian was near the far end of the longer limb of the gallery, uncoiling yards of cable, looking at a painting hanging to the right of the Stuart doors to the royal pew. He grimaced. "Don't like the look of that bastard either," he said. Simon came to look. It was a family group portrait, with a demure Queen Jane Seymour seated on the left, and a doughy-looking Prince Edward, standing on the right of Henry, who was, also seated, perched on the forward edge of a throne, legs akimbo, the left straight and thrust forward. His right arm was round Edward, his hand resting on Edward's shoulder. There were two other female figures occupying an edge of the group on each side. Alice had said they were the princesses, Mary and Elizabeth. Their faces looked demure and vacant. Henry's face radiated despotic arrogance. His tiny piggy eyes stared out from his bloated face with the glitter of evil. No, not even evil. Madness. Yeah, unattractive, I agree. He left Adrian linking equipment and fine-tuning it, something he couldn't help with, and went in search of Alice. He found her walking away from the administrative block, housed in the old palace stables. His stomach gave its now familiar lurch at the sight of her. She smiled warmly at him. "I was on my way to see how you were doing," she said. "Oh, fine, thank you. I left Adrian, he's my technical expert, fitting up the monitoring, but actually I wanted to ask you about something I found amongst the archives. That's why I came to find you." It probably sounded as lame as that to her, too, but she gave no indication. "Certainly, that's what I'm here for. Have you got it with you?" "In the car, all of it. I thought I'd better return the documents promptly. I'm not great with paperwork. Something always goes missing." She grinned. "Okay, I'll open the archives office while you collect them. It's right next to my office. You remember where that is?" "Sure. In 5 minutes?" He'd already spread the documents out on a large table and found the one he wanted by the time Alice entered the room. She came up behind the chair he was sitting on. "What did you want to ask me?" He pointed to some cramped script written below the intricate drawing of the pretty ring. "I can't make out what this says," he explained. She stooped and leant across his shoulder. You get used to deciphering medieval script if you do a lot of it, but inevitably some hands are more difficult than others, and this. She leant nearer, and he felt a recognizable softness against his shoulder. Purposely done? No, she was concentrating. Delightful, though. This is more tricky than most. Yes. The author has written that Catherine Howard rarely wore rings, indeed was known for her sparsity of jewellery, even when queen, whereas Anne Boleyn always wore jewellery, especially a distinctive necklace fashioned around the letters A and B, and a family ring with a distinctive setting, of which the writer believes the drawing to be an accurate depiction. Simon waited with anticipated disappointment for the physical intimacy to come to an end as she stood up again. It didn't happen. Instead, she leant even closer. Her hair brushed his cheek. She peered intently at the sketch, a small frown on her face. He was going to have problems if this amount of physical intimacy continued, whether it was intended or not. He was already stirring in a quite inappropriate fashion. She turned to look at him. Their heads were very close. He found those huge green eyes even greener at this range. Her pupils grew wide. He very nearly kissed her. He managed to restrain himself from doing so, just. He didn't know her, he'd only just met her. Alice didn't jerk her head away. She blinked and, looking startled, slowly unbent herself. From the wording, I'd say the writing was 17th, not 16th century. She seemed flustered. And I don't agree with the author. I'm pretty certain that the ring is a family ring, but I think they've got the wrong family. I think that it is a Howard family ring. She turned and went over to a bookcase against the far wall, and returned, thumbing through a book as she did so. How did you find the drawing? I've never seen it before. It was on the back of the document. The description on the other side looked more important. I only found it by chance myself, flicking through the papers during a sleepless part of the night. He didn't explain why he had been sleepless, and she didn't ask. He sensed that she was struggling to find calm, and if she was feeling the sort of turmoil he was feeling, that wasn't going to happen easily. Yes, here we are. This is an authenticated portrait of Catherine Howard, and there's the ring. She laid it on the desk in front of him and pointed to the figure's left hand. There was an awkward pause, and then she said, "How do you think your colleague will be getting on in the gallery?" "Oh, I left him twiddling dials. It'll take him a while to calibrate everything. Would you like to come and see? We can show you what it should do." She smiled. She had regained her composure. "Yes, please. I'd be interested." Back in the gallery, Adrian had everything up and running. He proudly demonstrated the recording of their approaching footsteps, multiple video images of the two of them from all angles, and, worryingly, thermal images of their bodies and the background. Why Simon's image wasn't bright scarlet and pulsating, he didn't know. It should have been. Alice was interested in the thermal imaging, which she'd never seen before. Could it record in colour the sudden plunge in temperature described by so many of the witnesses? "Sure," replied Adrian. "You see how the background is pale yellow? Well, the ambient temperature is currently," he looked at another dial, 18 degrees. With a drop in temperature, the colours will go through browns to greens to blues to purples, and the other way, with increasing temperature, through oranges and reds. It's amazing." "Thank you," said Adrian, grinning. Alice made some further small talk, then excused herself to organise the shutting up of the palace for the night. "What a cracker," said Adrian after she had gone. Simon agreed, as non-committally as he could manage. Ridiculously, he felt a stab of jealousy.